Thank you for joining me today. I am happy to speak to Amy, who's done a lot of photography in Alaska and even has a couple books. Salmon in the Trees, which is an interesting title when I always think of salmon in the water. So she'll probably share a little bit about that. And then more recent, The Salmon Way, and all the time she's spent in Alaska. And for me, I've been going back and forth to Alaska, but just a sliver of the state. And we all know Alaska is just massive, and most of us just don't even get to all of the little nooks and crannies to explore it. So, welcome, Amy. Thank you for joining me.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
So, go back to the beginning. Like, what inspired you to pick up a camera? I know that's always a fascinating question for many of us.
At where I am in my life, though, I can look back and it's an easy question to answer. When I was a kid, I was one of those feral kids, who was always outside, climbing trees, swimming in ponds, chasing frogs. Always had skinned knees and I was happiest when I was dirty and matted hair and just again kind of feral, like this feral child. But a lot of that's how a lot of kids my age and my era. That's how we all grew up.
Right.
But anyway, I loved it. And before when I was really young, like before I could read or write, I think I was doing what all humans have done since the dawn of human time. Like I was telling stories and that's how I was making sense of the world around me. And of course I was sharing my stories, with my family or my friends or whoever would listen. And again, I just think that's a very universal human trait, is storytelling. And so, I got a little bit older and I was starting to write a little bit. And then I started drawing to illustrate my stories. Because I just felt that was adding that visual element might be helpful to people. And then at some point, I think my dad, and I laugh now because we had and it was the latest and greatest camera. It was called the Kodak Pocket Camera. And it was called that because it fit in your pocket. And I'm laughing now, right? Because we all have telephones that also happen to be cameras that easily fit in our pockets. But this was revolutionary back in the late 60s, early 70s. And so we had one of those cameras. And the second that got put into my hands and I figured out what it could do, it just completely changed my world. It's like, oh, wow. Like, this is a really immediate way now for me to illustrate my stories. So it's not, I don't necessarily say I picked up the camera. The camera was like put in my hand, but I figured out like this is a really powerful tool, to illustrate the story. So I think that was just always my passion. And I think it's a passion for a lot of kids, at that age, but I always say I just never outgrew that passion. I tried to like make a living in other ways, and I did make a living in other ways, but I wasn't very passionate about it.
Yeah.
So I always just kind of kept coming back to visual storytelling.
Oh, that's fabulous. So was the Salmon in the Trees then your first book, or since you mentioned writing, or was it a second or third book?
Yeah, Salmon in the Trees was my first book, but prior to that, oh gosh, so I started professionally publishing both my written stories, accompanied with photos, or one or the other. Maybe I'd just do the photos or I'd just do the written story. But ideally, I was always trying to do both,
right,
and publish like the full story. And I started doing that in 1993. So I can't do math right now, but like a couple decades, I think, of doing that really helped hone those skills, and it really helped me prepare to then embark on a book, because a book is a really daunting task especially when you've been doing maybe 2,000 word stories illustrated with 8 photos maybe, and not that those are easy, like none of those are easy either, but I've been doing it long enough and I realized it's like, okay, and I still do magazine work, but it's like magazines, the stories, they're great. I love working on them, but you don't really get to go very far in depth And at the end of the day, like the final story is, back when we just had print magazines, like it kind of had a shelf life of a month.
Yeah,
Now
exactly.
with the internet, hopefully the shelf life of those stories can last longer or forever. But at the same time, people's attention spans are kind of like, okay, like this magazine came out, whether it's online or it's still in print, we kind of think in terms of, okay, when's the next issue? We don't necessarily like go back and, consult other issues or something like that. So I decided that a book was a way to really go way more in depth on a topic and spend way more time researching, photographing, gathering these stories. And then at the end of that project, you have this curated book that if you do
Yeah.
your job well, it can be timeless. And it's just, to me, it's a much more powerful tool if you're trying to influence decision makers, which is what I'm always trying to do now with my work. I'm trying to, I always say, don't make books like to get out there and make money. I make them to make a difference. If they can do both, great.
Yeah.
Both, but my primary focus is trying to get those books into the hands of people who are in positions of power to actually make policy decisions or do whatever that's going to help nature. I mean, that's, kind of again, in a nutshell, that's what I'm always trying to do with my work, is to connect people to why nature is important to humanity and really all living beings, on Earth. So Salmon in the Trees, so what I was looking to do with that project was to tell a new story of an old place, and that's the Tongass National Forest. That's in Alaska. Is the largest national forest in the United States. And for about 5 decades or so, it was just getting rapidly logged in an industrial scale that was not sustainable at all. And we were cutting down virgin old growth forest. Yeah. And
Horrible.
one time there had been a lot of divisiveness, a lot of fighting, they called it the Timber War days, trying to at least slow this down and just say, hey, what the heck are we doing? Is this really what we do, with this magnificent forest? So I wasn't the first person by any means to come along and recognize that how special this place is. But I came along at a time, so it was kind of like the mid 2000s, when we were really kind of in a transition phase with how we were viewing that forest. And I did realize, it's like, and what it wasn't, we were kind of at a crossroads. It's like, all right, are we going to continue this timber first mentality and really cut everything that's left,
Yeah.
or, there's still time, right? Can we step back and say, hey, maybe we might want to look at this forest in a new way? So I kind of felt like my job was to help people look at this forest in a way maybe they had never looked at it before. Because for too long, we had really been looking at it in terms of timber.
Right.
So it's like, there are certainly other values here we can look at. So I was like, all right, how do you tell a new story of this place? And get people to look at it in a new way. So I was doing all my research before I even went, up to the Tongass and spent a lot of time there, doing a lot of research. And I came across this super dry scientific article. And it was a scientific paper. And, I'm not a scientist. I'm an avid naturalist, but I'm not a trained scientist. But I do try and read these scientific papers, if they're going to relate to the work I'm doing. And the title of the paper was "The Upstream Flow of Marine-Derived Nutrients in a Terrestrial Environment." And yeah, I almost stopped.
Yeah. I was gonna
I'm like, oh, I don't know if I can get through this, but something about it, I don't know what it was, something compelled me to keep at it, and I struggled through it, and I got to the end, and I finished and kind of sat there for a second, and all of a sudden something just clicked, and this light bulb went on over my head, and I'm like, whoa, do you mean what you're trying to tell me is that there are salmon in the trees? Because if that's what you're really trying to say with this paper, that is the coolest thing I've ever heard. And I got to tell that story, because this is really, really awesome. So, so the way this works, for listeners who don't know anything about salmon, so Pacific salmon, wild Pacific salmon, so born in freshwater streams and rivers. They head out to the ocean to mature at a certain stage. And then they become full-grown adults. And then if they're still alive, all goes well, they haven't gotten eaten or scooped up in a net or something, then they come back to their very the same birth streams, where they were born, which in and of that is just remarkable. So in the Tongass National Forest, there are 5,000 salmon spawning streams throughout this whole forest. The whole forest is about the size of the state of West Virginia, the United States. So that's how big it is. 5,000 salmon spawning streams. There's some of the highest densities of both brown and black bears in the entire world live in this forest. So, so when all these millions and millions of salmon are coming back, like into the forest, all these bears, I mean, they're just hungry. They're just waiting. Like this is their big hit of protein and fat that they've been waiting for, all summer. So here come all these salmon. Here come all the bears. And bears are not social animals. They really do not want to be around each other. But when the food supply is that plentiful, they're all going to congregate. But there's going to be a lot of tension and stress and kind of fighting, and bears really don't want to have to get into fights because someone's going to get hurt or killed.
Right.
What often happens when all these salmon are coming into the forest and all these bears are coming down to the streams, a lot of the bears are grabbing a fish and they're taking it away from the streams and they're taking it into the forest to get away from the other bears. Yeah, and if you spend enough time like on a salmon spawning stream where there are a lot of bears, you'll see this. It's like, oh wow, here comes a bear kind of out of nowhere, grabs a fish like as fast as it can catch one and just takes off. And then if you start going into the forest, like away from the stream around this time of year when all this is happening, if you look down, you're like, oh my gosh, there are so many salmon carcasses. Bites of salmon and salmon heads and a tail over there and just the guts, here.
Yeah. Oh.
Carcasses all throughout this forest. And then if you look up, you're like, wow, these trees are really big and like much bigger than the ones that are, far, far from salmon streams or on a stream where there are no salmon. And so this is exactly what scientists did, who ended up writing this paper. We're actually just trying to quantify how many salmon bears eat, but in order to do that, they have to follow salmon into the woods.
Yeah.
For the salmon. Well, they did. They followed the salmon, they followed the bears into the woods, right? And that's when they started noticing, it's like, wow, these trees are really big and, what's going on here? So they started taking tree core samples from the trees and they analyzed the DNA. What is in this tree? And they found ridiculously high concentrations of what's called nitrogen 15, which is a nitrogen variant that comes from the ocean. So ocean nitrogen get inside of a tree. Well, it swam there. It swam there in the bodies of salmon. And then how did it get into the tree? It was delivered to the forest floor by all those bears. Yeah. And at the time, the nutrients from all the bodies of the salmon decompose into the soil and the trees absorb them through their roots. So there are really, if a scientist would correct me and say, well, there's not really salmon in the trees, but there are marine-derived nutrients in the trees. But because I'm not a scientist, I took a little bit of a poetic license with that, and that's why the book is called Salmon in the Trees.
No, I love that.
Yeah, and what's really cool about this connection is that it's just like me reading that paper, something clicked and a light bulb went on and I just thought, oh my gosh, like this is incredible. And that's what I found with audiences, that I give a lot of public presentations. And when Salmon in the Trees, the book came out, I was giving a lot of talks about that. And I could literally see, the instant that the light bulb would go off in people's heads in the audience, because they were just, their mouths would drop and they'd get this big smile on their face. They're like, and then people would come up to me afterwards and say, that's the coolest thing I've ever heard. And,
right.
Which is exactly what was my reaction, right, when I learned about it. So, but to me, the really, really cool thing is that if you can understand this connection, this remarkable connection of how it is that there are salmon in the trees, you will understand an entire ecosystem. Because that connection can't happen without all those pieces in that ecosystem being intact and functioning. So you need the stream, You need that stream to be healthy. You need the forest. You need the trees to shade the stream because that helps the salmon grow. You need the salmon. You need all those bears. You need the trees, of course. You actually need a lot of fungi underneath the ground that's actually helping those trees absorb the salmon nutrients. You need everything, and you need everything to be intact. And so when people understand that, then the next thing really they start doing on their own is they start asking questions. They're like, okay, if this ecosystem is supporting this really awesome connection between salmon and the trees, well, what happens if we start cutting down all those trees?
Right.
What happens? What happens if we start overfishing? What happens if we pollute the salmon streams, with mining, toxic mining waste or whatever? Because if one of those pieces gets removed, that whole circle of life becomes unraveled quickly.
Yeah.
And that's happened in other parts of the country where we used to have incredible runs of salmon and incredible forests and all of that. We had salmon in the trees in other parts, and we don't have it anymore because we started chipping away and removing those pieces. So what I love about this whole salmon in the trees idea is it just gets people's wheels spinning, and they're like, okay, like I get it, but what are we doing? What are we doing to ensure, that there will always be salmon in the trees? I mean, that's the question I really want them to ask, and they do.
Yeah. And to be part of something so powerful, I mean, that's really amazing. So have you been seeing some changes just since, you published the book and maybe people are becoming more aware? I mean, I recently just heard that there's some issues with, I mean, there's many different kinds of salmon in Alaska, but recently I think they're talking about not allowing fishing of a certain type of salmon, which is discouraging. Something's not going right.
Right. Well, right. Exactly. Well, I will say with the Tongass, there's so my Salmon in the Trees, I think was published in 2010. To this day, I'm still giving talks. I mean, I think it is kind of one of those timeless
Yeah.
subjects, because again, it's really about ecology and ecosystems, but of a specific place. But so to me, it's still very relevant, and again, I'm still getting asked to do talks all the time. But there's been a lot of positive things that have happened with the Tongass since I started working on that issue, which was now 16 years ago. Yeah, there's just so and that's and it's great to see that. Are there always going to be threats? I think there always are going to be. As long as you've got something valuable that somebody wants and can monetize it in some way, I think we're always going to have to be vigilant. And my ego isn't big enough to say, oh, well, my book came out and that just saved the Tongass, because no, like it doesn't. I wish it could be that simple and it could work that quickly and effectively, but that's just not how the world works. But I think probably one of the biggest contributions the book and the story have made with that issue is my timing was very good. It just came at a time when people, I think, were wanting to tell a new story of this place, but until a new story comes along, it's hard. It's hard for human beings to imagine a different way of thinking and a different way of being and a different way of acting. So I think the book, in combination with a movement that was already happening, just helped propel, and maybe introduce a new story into people's minds. So that's, for me, that's super gratifying to see that. And what's also gratifying is now so many people that I met through that process, or that I really don't know well at all, if there is some article out there in current news about a connection between salmon and trees, it's like I get a million emails from people going, have you seen this? Like, this is so cool, because they know about it, right? And they know about it through the story. So that's great. And it has really been I have seen it more kind of in mainstream stories and news. And at the time, nobody was really, it wasn't in a public dialogue. It's like, hey, the Tongass is a place where there's salmon in the trees. Like, we weren't talking like that, and now we are. So
right. And I think just the way you titled the book too, it brings something that sometimes is harder for some of us that are just, going about our lives to get interested in. When you make it interesting and it has a catch and a hook, literally, oh wow, what is this? And that's great as a storyteller to be able to do that.
Yeah, yeah. No, when anything is unexpected, that I think that does get our attention. And just yeah, the title alone is like, what? Like what? I mean, it makes you pause, right? And you're like, what is she talking about? And that's all you really need to hook people and get them in. And it's interesting because most people just think, oh, so you mean like when an eagle carries a salmon up into a tree, or a bear carries a salmon up into a tree? And I say, well, no, that's salmon up a tree. That's not actually salmon in a tree.
Right.
So then that intrigues them a little bit more. It's like, well, how is it that salmon get in the trees? So um, yeah, it's pretty awesome.
So was your interest in the salmon then what kind of led you to do the second book, The Salmon Way?
Yeah, no, great question. Right. So working on salmon in the trees, my goal was really to use that remarkable connection to help people understand what makes the whole place, the whole Tongass National Forest, so special and worthy of our attention and worthy of preserving. Um, uh, I also related it back to people. So in that in Salmon in the Trees, there's a lot of profiles, and people are profiled and kind of what's their relationship with the Tongass.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was very much, while it was definitely an ecology book, it was also very, very much a people book, in that it's like, okay, if this connection between salmon and trees is so important for the ecosystem, why is it also important for people?
Right.
And so I spent a lot of time interviewing people, traveling around to many different communities in Southeast Alaska. Part of what makes Southeast Alaska so wonderful is there's a lot of islands. There's thousands of islands, and then there's this kind of narrow strip of the mainland that's very mountainous. And there's really nothing. There are no roads or bridges that are connecting any of those islands, or really any of the islands, to the mainland.
Yeah.
So, and really the best way, you can fly to different areas, but the best way to get around is by boat.
Right.
As far as kind of being more reliable, and you're also going to see a lot more that way. So all these different communities that are spread throughout Southeast Alaska, they're geographically separate from each other, because again, you can't drive there easily.
Right.
And I think in part because of that, and just kind of depends on like what kind of the mainstay of each economy is. But I think because of that, they've all developed their own personalities, the towns themselves, and a lot of them are quite different from one another. Like you might have like Alaska Native villages, you might have a very like Scandinavian, Norwegian community. Juneau is the capital, so that's just a more kind of vibrant, it's a bigger community, but they're all really different from one another. So, but I was fortunate to travel around to many of them, and it was super interesting because I really got a sense of all these different personalities of the communities. But so they were very different, but at the same time, the one thing that really connected people was salmon.
Really?
And oh yeah, like when you start talking about salmon, it's like everybody now kind of have this thing in common, with each other. And there were a lot of commonalities as far as how people valued salmon and how they felt about them. And that really struck me. And so I was like, wow, if salmon are this important to people in Southeast Alaska, and they can be a uniter,
Right.
this common language, right, that people speak. Are they this important to people throughout the rest of Alaska where there are salmon? And what are those relationships like? So that is the focus of my current book, which is called The Salmon Way. The subtitle I love, it's called An Alaska State of Mind.
Yes.
I mean, it really, like salmon, they really are a state of mind. I think when you live with them. So that book, I set out to really explore and celebrate the different relationships that people have with salmon. So no matter where I went, like throughout the state, and no matter who I met with, and I tried to meet with the greatest diversity of people that I could. So I met with Alaska Native people who for thousands and thousands of years, their entire culture has been built by and revolves around this, sacred fish.
Yeah.
with commercial fishermen who catch and sell salmon for livelihood, and met with sport fishermen who guide other people, like tourists or recreationists, to try and catch their own salmon. So a wide diversity of people, and I asked them all pretty much the same question. Um, you know, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, please tell me, what's your relationship with salmon? What does salmon mean to you? And after spending several years
Really?
oh yeah, easy, because salmon have a season, and I want to be meeting with people when they're actually in their salmon season, whether they're native people putting up salmon for the winter because now this is their winter food, or they're commercial fishermen who only have a few months like to make good from catching salmon, or sport fishermen similar, because salmon aren't coming in all the time, or you can't fish for them all year.
Right.
So it took me several seasons to be able to go around and meet with all these people, because everyone's busy with salmon at the same time, and so
Oh, right.
one season, right? It took me several seasons. But so after several seasons of traipsing around and hanging out with people and really getting to understand their way of life that salmon allow them to live, I came back and I had a lot of interviews, to transcribe. You know what this is like. And so I must have had at least like 40 like really solid, really good interviews with a diversity of people. And so I came home and I transcribed them all, which, as you know, takes hours and hours. I typed them all up and I printed them all out and I spread them all across on my floor, because I was kind of overwhelmed at that point. I had tens of thousands of photographs to go through.
Wow, yeah.
Oh my gosh, like I have all this raw material, which I know is fabulous, but how am I gonna stitch this all together and make a compelling story?
Right.
Again, I was really overwhelmed at this point. But I spread out all the interviews on the floor, and I started just picking up pieces of paper and just kind of glancing at certain words just started popping out. And I highlighted all those words, and I put everything back on the floor. And then I just started looking at the highlighted words. And what I realized is like, wow, it doesn't matter really who I was talking to. They're all telling me the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
They're me the same answers. Again, whether they're an indigenous person, a commercial fisherman, they're all telling me, when I asked them, what does salmon mean to you? They were all saying things like family, community, my connection to a home stream, a very valued way of life, wanting to pass this way of life on to my children and my grandchildren. Everybody said that.
Wow.
And I just thought, wow, this is the story. This is what's so powerful, is that it doesn't matter, if they're fishing for their food, their livelihood, or for fun, they're all valuing salmon in the same way. And I just thought that was beautiful, and very heartfelt. And I also felt like, again, this is the common language, right? That everybody. These are universal human values. But, family, community, a connection, a place where I belong, a place to call home, a place where I feel like I'm home. We all need that, whether it's through salmon, whether it's through a forest, whether it's through birds. I mean, whatever it is, I think that's how we are, all of us used to be a long, long time ago, connected.
Right.
We lived and to the earth. In general. So here are people in Alaska connected to salmon, and that's their portal
Yeah.
to what it means to be a human being, I think, and to live in this world. And I was just so moved by this. I'm like, all right, these are the stories. This is how I'm going to tell the story. I'll profile very different people, but I'm going to bring out what they all have in common.
Yeah. Oh, that must have taken hours just sorting through, choosing the images then to tell that story.
A year. Easily, I took a year. I mean, to actually sit down and write the book and edit all the photos and decide which ones were going to, help illustrate. I mean, it was probably a year and a half. That was the actual writing and putting it together. And it was another 3+ years to actually go out and spend time with people and make the images.
Wow.
So, yeah. Yeah, it was from the day I walked out my door to the day I held the book in my hand was 5 years.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
Wow.
But here's the really beautiful part for me. I didn't want to stop. Like I could have kept working on this book for the rest of my life, because when you sit down with people and you say, tell me what salmon mean to you, the most heartfelt stuff comes out. And I didn't know them and they didn't know me. And by the end of it, we're hugging each other and we're crying, and it didn't, but tears of joy, right?
Right, right, yeah.
And it didn't matter if they were gruff, old, kind of rough and tumble fishermen. They were crying. I mean, it was, I mean, that's just how special salmon are. And I really learned, and especially for me too, like when salmon get in your blood, they're in your blood. Like there's no going back. You've crossed over some kind of magic threshold, and it's like, wow, this is the way to be in the world, and this is the way to live in the world.
Right.
So that's what it did for me.
I was gonna say, now salmon's just part of your being too, with the two books. And
Oh yeah.
so
Yeah.
I mean, that's the hard part too, is sometimes committing to finishing it because you want to hang on to that joy of the creative process. So what's next on the horizon for you?
Yeah, well, I'm still giving a lot of talks on both books, and I've actually combined bits and pieces of both into one talk. Kind of depends on like who's asking me to speak, but I'm doing a lot of outreach on both of those things, because salmon, while in parts of Alaska, not the whole state, but in parts of Alaska, salmon are doing well. In other parts of the state, they're not doing well. I live in Washington State. We used to be an incredible salmon state. Salmon here in Washington, Oregon, Northern California, and Southern British Columbia are not doing well. Down in the lower 48 states, we have lost 90% of our historical salmon abundance. And that's due to many different factors, but mainly habitat destruction. We've just destroyed their habitat. We either put dams in their rivers so they can't get up to their spawning grounds, or we're dumping toxic pollutants, in rivers that flow downstream. We're polluting the ocean. I mean, salmon are these key indicator species because they need it all. They need fresh water to be healthy. And in order for fresh water to be healthy, the land has to be healthy. And then they need the ocean to be healthy. So I always say, when salmon are doing well, we can do well too. But when salmon are in trouble, we're actually in trouble too. Like whether we're making that connection or not, it's like, if we're polluting waterways, and that's killing off salmon, it's like, that's harming us too, whether we think it is or not. So, so down here, again, where I live in lower 48, there's I will probably for the rest of my life, I will never run out of opportunities to talk about salmon and how important they are and how important healthy habitat is to them and what we might think about doing to help restore some of our runs. I think it would be unlikely that we're going to get all of our abundance back, but there's a lot we can be doing to bring back a lot of salmon here. So, so as far as what's next, it's, whenever you're doing projects and again, you're doing them to make a difference, people think that the second the book is done and you're holding it in your hands, that you're done, right? Like, and up to that point, you've done a lot of work and you've gone through a lot of ups and downs to get there too. And I liken it to, it's like giving birth, only you were pregnant for several years.
Yeah, right.
Just like giving birth, when that book is born, when a child is born, you don't just abandon it and move on to something else. Like the real work now begins. And so with a book, it's like, I got to get that book out there because if I make a difference, it's not going to make a difference if it's not out there, if I'm not talking about it, if I'm not, giving interviews or, trying to talk to decision makers. Or in my case, what really helps me get the message out there is if I partner with groups like nonprofit organizations and even government agencies that are working to either, in the case of the lower 48, restore salmon runs, or in the case of Alaska, maintain what they still have and maybe fight off like big threats to what they still have. So when I partner with those organizations or agencies, that's when the message can really, I think, do the most good, because I can reach hearts and minds, and I can get people inspired and fired up about something, but I don't have the capacity to then follow up, and really what I call doing the hard work, because it is really hard work trying to either restore something, bring something back, or maintain what you already had from really big threats. It's amazing to me in Alaska. Alaska is right now, really the last best place in the United States that still has healthy salmon habitat. I mean, there are problems, but they still have habitat, and that's key. Like down here, we've destroyed so much habitat. It is very difficult to restore it. In Alaska, they still have habitat, and they still have, in certain parts, very abundant runs of salmon. In other parts, not so much. The salmon runs are crashing, in parts of the state, which is very alarming. So they still have this. They're the last best place to have it, and yet the threats to salmon are probably bigger than they've ever been. Wow. Because the proposals, like the size and scale of these mines that are proposed, and mining takes a lot of water, takes a lot of energy, and in general, we just kind of take the toxic waste and we just dump it into streams, or we dump it behind a dam of some kind. Right. And foolproof, and they do breach, and those toxins, they're going to get into the environment one way or the other. So what's next? Right before I was talking to you, I just got off the phone with one of my partners, and we were just talking about that. Where are we going to go? Where are we going to go next? And who are we going to target? Who are we going to talk to? As far as like what's the most urgent threat that we need to address right now? Right. So it's a lot of outreach, and I don't think a lot of photographers understand that. But then again, a lot of photographers aren't necessarily like using their work in the way I'm using it too, and that's just fine. But in my case, it's like I really want this work to make a difference. So I always say the real work begins once the book is finished or the presentation. And now it's like get it out in the world, and that takes a lot of time.
Yeah, that definitely does. What are some of the nonprofits that you are working with then to support? Like you said, it's kind of hard once you've destroyed an environment, but what nonprofits that people could support? That's a good way to.
Sure. In Alaska, there's a wonderful group called Salmon State. And all of these are online, but salmonstate.org, is their website. Wonderful. What I really love about them is they're very much thinking holistically. And it's like, hey, and that's why they're called Salmon State. It's like, let's take a look at the whole state, because the state is huge. I mean, it's more than twice the size of Texas. I mean, it's enormous. And there are salmon runs from the very southern, in the Tongass, which is like the southern tip of the state, all the way up now. I mean, there's actually salmon starting to come into the Arctic. Wow. And that's climate change is kind of fueling that. But it's huge. There's salmon everywhere. And so in the past, it was really hard. There was no one organization kind of looking at the whole state and the state of salmon. But this group is doing that, and they're great to work with. Trout Unlimited is another great partner. Down here in the lower 48, Save Our Wild Salmon. They're doing a lot of work on trying to restore salmon. And a very current issue right now is attempting to remove 4 dams that are on the lower Snake River. And the Snake River is the major tributary into the Columbia River. And the Columbia River, it empties into the ocean right on the border of Washington and Oregon. Yeah. And at one point, the Columbia River, that whole system, was one of the greatest salmon producing systems on Earth. Wow. It was, I wasn't alive when it was the greatest salmon producing system on Earth. But to just know that we could restore, especially if those dams are removed with that, and get salmon back up into that Snake River habitat, that would go a long way, long way. So there's a lot of momentum and political will right now to actually do that. So that's super exciting. I've been doing a lot of outreach around that particular issue.
So that one was saveourwildsalmon.org?
Yeah, or it's Save Our Wild Salmon. I think their website is wildsalmon.org.
Okay. And we'll be sure to put those in the show notes too for people. Because I think a
Yeah,
lot of times that's just it. They hear something, they get impassioned, obviously, at that. And that's the point to grab them. Like,
sure.
you can do something and it's going to take a lot. Because unfortunately, these corporations, these other entities are so much larger. I mean, they have so much money and people and power in place already. So every effort is appreciated.
Yeah, they do, but you know what? The one thing they don't have, and I feel like the Wizard of Oz or the Tin Man when I say this, the one thing they don't have is a heart,
Yes.
and they don't have the passion. And I am amazed at how far passion can go to actually stop, something huge and something toxic and something that's going to destroy habitat. A perfect example is Bristol Bay in Alaska. This is home to the largest sockeye salmon fishery in the entire world. And for the last 20 plus years, that area has been fighting a huge mine called the Pebble Mine. It did not get built, but it came very, very close. And they were totally outspent and outmaneuvered and out everything, but they won. And this just happened in January. They won. Now, is it permanent? When you're coming, when you're trying to like preserve Earth's natural processes and gifts, I don't think it's ever permanent. There are always going to be interests that are, trying to get in there. But a huge victory, huge. I mean, it was basically like, little passionate groups coming together. And this was key. This was absolutely key. So this was commercial fishermen, sport fishermen, and indigenous Alaskans all coming together, to fight for Bristol Bay and the salmon ways of life there. And, couldn't hold a candle to the money, that the mining interests had, but they won. So never ever, what's that great quote by Margaret Mead, never underestimate the power of a group of, thoughtful, passionate, committed people. I mean, it's the only thing that has really changed anything for the good in the world. Yeah. So there are victories. They're very long, drawn out, and hard fought. But man, when they happen, it's just like, where's the next one?
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of leads a little bit to now with the internet and social media, you're probably able to reach a larger audience with your messaging to get it out there. How do you
Mhm.
see that's even changed with your photography and your writing?
Yeah, it's interesting. When I grew up, there were three television channels,
Yeah.
like, I mean, like main ones, right? Like three networks,
Yeah.
maybe some ancillary stuff like Sci-Fi Channel, maybe, but that went off at like 10 o'clock. Remember, it just like went to
Yes.
white
Yeah.
static. So growing up, like three big TV networks, you had Time, you had Life magazine, you had some big magazines. And it's interesting because now, right, like it's infinity.
It is.
Like
It's crazy.
24 hours a day, cable news, Twitter feeds, the whole bit. And you think, this is great because now we have all these incredible ways to get our message out there. And on the one hand, it is great. And we can also be our own publicists, right? Like we don't necessarily have to wait for a magazine to promote our messaging. We can just put it out there. So in those respects, I think it's positive. But on the flip side of that, it's like, wow, we are now all swimming. I wouldn't say swimming. We're all now drowning, like in a sea of tweets and blogs and posts and videos and cat videos and just
Yeah.
stupid stuff, right?
Right.
Like just so many distractions, so many, oh, there's another shiny thing. And I think it's changed our attention span, it's changed the way we absorb or seek out news and what is news anymore anyway, like what's real, what isn't. So I actually think our job is harder than it's ever been. And so sometimes when I get a little overwhelmed by those thoughts, I always come back to, it's like, what hasn't changed? is really good, strong storytelling.
Right.
Like, that has not changed. Maybe the medium in which we put it out there has changed, but basic, good, strong storytelling is that's not changed. So your story is either compelling or it isn't, and that's always my challenge. It's like, all right, how do I create a compelling story? And then I'll think about then how do I get it out there? Because if it is compelling and you do it well and you do it, and you're maybe tailoring it to different audiences depending on the medium, it's going to strike somebody if you did your job well. If it's a compelling story, those tend to rise to the top a little bit more.
Right.
But I still think it's harder than it's ever been.
Yeah. You are correct, because there is almost too much. It's information overload, and people can tend to, they're not exposed to as much variety, I think. If you go back to the years when we had like the radio or the 3 or 4 TV stations at most, I mean, at some point you probably listened or watched something that, yeah, I don't know if I'll like this, but so you got exposed to a variety. Whereas now, if you only wanted to, like, to use your example, watch cats all day, you can just select that. It's crazy. And unfortunately, you don't get exposed to anything else, perhaps.
Right. And, and I will say, I think, yes, with all that overload of whatever stimulus or whatever you're letting in, if you're letting in news, most of the news is really bad news. It's really depressing, oh, another shooting or another destruction of this and climate change. There's like this huge, black umbrella of climate change over all of us now, right? And so I think, a lot of us choose not to let in a lot of news anymore because it is overwhelming. It's depressing. We're kind of left with, well, what on earth can I do?
Right.
So again, I think that's difficult too. But I think all the more reason, and again, it's always going to be my challenge. It's like, how do I tell a story again that is compelling, gets people's attention, but lifts them up and reaches their heart and gives them some kind of hope, because you have to do that for people. We can't just depress people and leave them, overwhelmed and shell-shocked, so how do I craft a story that does that, but at the same time still allows me to deliver, the bad news? Because I'm not out there necessarily. I mean, I'm going to deliver hopefully a hopeful, inspiring story. But the whole reason I'm out there with the story to begin with is to try and help people understand. It's like, the Tongass isn't going to be a place where there's salmon in the trees if we're not making sure it stays that way. Or, salmon runs in Alaska in Bristol Bay are not going to stay that way unless we can ensure that giant mines don't come in and destroy the habitat. And so on and so on. And down where I am, it's like, we're not going to get those salmon ways of life back. We're not going to restore salmon runs if we don't do X, Y, and Z. So that's always my challenge, like lift people up, inspire them. And hopefully, if I do my job right, they're inspired enough to, like, all they have to ask now is, what do you want me to do? I'll do it.
Yeah, exactly.
And then that's where partnering with organizations doing the work on the ground, because I'm not, that's not my skill set and I don't have the capacity to do that. That's why partnering with them is so important. It's like, oh, here's what you do, and here's the group that's going to tell you what to do and how to do it.
That's excellent. So do you have tips for other photographers who may find a project, something they're passionate about, how to navigate maybe doing something more than just taking pretty pictures per se?
Yeah. Yes. If you have, and I think it kind of takes the right personality too. And there is nothing wrong with going out with your camera and experiencing nature and feeling really happy, and because that is what it does for us, right? There's nothing wrong with doing that and coming back with photos that you put on your wall, or maybe you try and get published somewhere, and that's what you do with your. There's nothing wrong with that. And I do think it takes kind of a certain personality to then want to go farther and say, okay, I love being out in nature. I'm making these beautiful images, but I'm also seeing, threats or the degradation of a place I love very much. And how can I use my work then to, make sure that this place stays wonderful?
Yeah.
Those are the kind of photographers I love talking to, because it's like, okay, you're asking the right question. Like, that's how I started, right? It's
Right.
like, threats. These are and I seeing. So how can I help other people understand what's going on and move them to want to do something? So so it starts with passion for sure. And I always advise photographers, it's like, pick what you are passionate about. Don't there's another quote. I used to have it written on my wall and I'm looking, I don't see it. It's something, goes something along the lines of, it's like, don't look at the world and ask, what needs to be done. And instead, it's like, what are you passionate about? And go do that, because that's what the world needs. It needs people who are passionate about doing anything, really.
Right. Yeah.
Like, that. Just go and do what you're passionate about. So that's why I advise photographers. It's like, whether it's a place or a species or people, a culture, whatever it is, whatever you're passionate about, focus on that and figure out, who else is out there working to, like, say, restore this place or protect this place from being destroyed in some way, and partner, and but learn how to craft a story. And a lot of photographers come to me and say, okay, you're a writer and a photographer. I'm not a writer. Like, it's like, well, let's think about that. You're telling me you're not a writer, but can you write a caption, for your photographs? Can you write, a paragraph that talks about the place? It's like, I think you're more of a writer or storyteller, than you think you are. Do you have to write a book? No. I mean, because that is daunting. It's daunting. And I'm a writer, right? No, but team up with a writer. Again, partner. But even like, let's say you made an exhibit of 15, awesome images with compelling captions, like a 30, 40 word caption. You've got a story now, and that whole story can now be on walls and can travel to different communities or wherever. To a Capitol building, to a government agency, like whoever really needs this to get this story in front of, you're now telling the story that way. So I always do advise photographers, try not to get too overwhelmed at the start, because the start can be so overwhelming that you never start.
Mm-hmm.
Just start. You don't have to have it all figured out, and you won't have it all figured out. And even if you think you have it figured out, once you start, it's all going to change anyway. So just start. Like Bilbo Baggins would say, in The Hobbit, like, just walk out your door and go on an adventure, because the story will unfold. The deeper you get into this stuff, it will all unfold. You will meet incredible people. It will just come together. But not if you don't walk out your door.
That is wonderful advice, Amy. That's a great place to leave this today, too. So where can people reach out to you if people do have questions or want to pick your brain about salmon or anything else? Or
Sure. Probably best way is through my website. So it's myname.com. My name being Amy Gulick. So amygulick.com, AMYGULICK.com. And you can email me through that and reach me that way. And I'm always happy to answer questions, particularly about these kinds of projects. Because if you've never done one before, they're daunting. You just think you have to have all these pieces in place before you start, and you really don't.
Yeah, I think that's the ultimate message. Just get started. Just go do it.
Yeah, because I mean, I never really learned anything by staying home.
Thank you so much, Amy. This has been really enlightening. I really appreciate you taking time with me today. Thanks.
Oh, you're very welcome. Thank you.